To the early birds, welcome to our April CAN meeting. I'm Ann Coffey, the CEO of CMPE, one of the coordinating hosts of CAN, and I want to start off by thanking each and every one of you for being here and coming today. Your presence really is helping us stay connected and deepening our understanding of what is happening in our community and learning together, which is central to co-creating the much needed change we all know we need to make. As always, I want to start off by reading our guiding principles. First one, ensure authentic diversity, equity, and inclusion through all CAN work. Co-create priorities with a bias toward action and change. Share learning and ownership throughout the sector. Value strength of relationships over strength of individuals. Power with versus power over. Expand what is good and assess opportunities for growth. Share and be a catalyst for connections, access, information, and resource flow, and exemplify and advocate. This space is for everyone who is interested in helping our nonprofit sector make a greater impact.
Poetry souffle.
Yes, can you,
Okay.
I'd like to ask everybody to put themselves on mute if you haven't done that at this point. So thank you. To make a greater impact. And so please invite others to join us. This is an open space, and the more, the better. As a reminder, we will be recording the program portion of this session. The report outs and discussion portion will not be recorded. And we ask that everyone stay on mute unless you are asking questions during the Q&A session. Throughout the program, please feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat. And like past meetings, we will start with an opening conversation with our guest, and then move to our candid breakout groups where you'll have an opportunity to connect with others and have a deeper conversation about this topic. And our guests will be with us when you return. So come back ready to ask questions and continue the conversation and learning. We kicked off this public safety series in January. If you recall, our first meeting topic was the city's response to public safety. And then in February, we met with Police Chief Erica Shields about her vision and goals. And in March, the topic was the community's response to public safety. And we had three very important community leaders who joined us: Dr. Eddie Woods, the CEO of No More Dots; Deborah Barnes-Byers, project manager of Pivot to Peace; and Trinidad Jackson, project manager of Youth Violence Prevention and Research Center. And today, our guest is Metro Council's response to public safety. And I will introduce our guest, and then I will turn the program over to the extraordinary Anthony Smith, another co-host and the CEO of Cities United. And I also want you to know, this looks a little one-sided. We did extend several invitations to ensure that we had both sides of the aisle to be with us today, but unfortunately, they were not able to join us because they had other demands on their time. So David James has done a lot in our community. He is a native of Louisville and dedicated his education and career to public service. He graduated from the University of Louisville, and his academic and professional experience is very relevant to today's topic of public safety. In 1984, President James joined the Louisville Police Department to begin his career in law enforcement and was the first African American to be awarded Rookie of the Year. James has held elected positions of president and vice president of the Louisville Fraternal Order of Police, and again was the first African American to serve as the FOP president and vice president. From 2004 to 2007, he was commissioner of the Kentucky Bureau of Investigation, the investigative arm of the Kentucky Attorney General's office. In 2010, he was elected to serve as councilman of the Metro Council's 6th district. In 2021, he was elected to serve a 4th term as president of the Metro Council. He has served 2 terms as majority leader, a position that elevated him to president pro tem of the Metro Council and the chair of the 17-member Democratic Caucus. As president, he is chair of the Metro Council's Committee of the Whole and Committee on Committees. He also created the Committee on Equity and Inclusion, which he chairs. He is the ex officio member of all Metro Council's standing committees. Some of his priorities include the state pension crisis, working with the community leaders, LMPD, and other stakeholders to begin the process of police reform, redoubling all efforts to public safety, a dangerously overcrowded jail, a youth detention service agency in desperate need of attention, a dilapidated police headquarters, and continued commitment to fight the opioid crisis, which saw a 14% increase of overdose deaths from the previous year. President James, thanks for being with us. Nicole, Councilwoman Nicole George. Nicole George is a certified social worker and her master's in social and has her master's in social work from Spalding University. In 2018, George was elected to represent the people of District 21 on Louisville Metro Council. In 2021, she serves as the chair of Metro Council's Public Works Committee, and she is also a member of the Budget, Parks and Sustainability and Public Safety Committees. Nicole has spent her career working with families to improve child safety and well-being. For over 15 years, Nicole has worked as a public servant, delivering both frontline services in child protection and holding an array of child welfare administrative roles. These jobs have focused on organizational improvement, policy analysis, and project management. Nicole spearheaded a statewide initiative to reduce trauma and enhance behavioral health services for children in foster care. She is professionally trained to use available assets to drive positive change. Nicole values the ability of community to enhance the lives of all citizens and support them in reaching their potential. She is a lifelong resident of the South End of Louisville, and she is committed to serve the citizens of the District 21 through her leadership in economic growth and maintaining the beauty of her district. So Anthony, the wonderful Anthony, I'm going to turn it over to you now to start facilitating this open conversation.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you, President James and Councilwoman George, for joining us today and having this conversation. Louisville, like most cities, have been dealing with a lot lately, and really trying to figure out what does public safety mean, how do we reimagine it, not just from the day-to-day community violence, but also from police violence that we saw with the loss of Breonna Taylor and Dave McAtee last year. As we continue to have this conversation as a city, we was really, and as Ann said, was really important to have multiple voices, because public safety is not just one person's job, it's all of our jobs. And some folks have more of responsibility than others based on their role. So as you all think about this conversation, and as we start, and I'll start with you, Councilwoman George, Councilmember George, if you don't mind, what is your personal vision for public safety? And how does your role as a council person help you work towards that goal?
Morning, can everyone hear me?
We can, you're good.
Excellent, okay, thank you. Well, first of all, let me just say I'm really honored to be here with you and excited about the important work that you do and the space that you provide for this conversation. I would say that, my vision for public safety is probably not much different than for those in this group, but I will say really being able to reshape what we mean by public safety within the overall community is part of my vision. So making sure that broadly in the community, when we talk about public safety, we're not just talking about those sort of reactionary responses that we see to ongoing crime, but really being able to address the root cause issues that lead to folks who engage in criminal behaviors in the first place, or that undermine the structures of our community that lead to more resilient neighbors and stronger connections. And so my vision of public safety means obviously greater supports and connections amongst neighbors so that they can be as resilient as possible in addressing need. It also means being able to really support a robust service array that involves, yes, of course, law enforcement, but across the spectrum, everything from social services, parks, public health, even public works, things that really contribute to quality of life and that will ultimately drive us to better outcomes as it relates to safety.
Thank you. President James, same question. What's your vision, personal vision, and how does your role as a council member, actually council president, help kind of work towards that goal?
First, I'll say thanks for having me here. And I would say that I would echo that everything that Councilman George just said. And I would add to that, as the president of the council, you get to see things from a different point of view. People have a misconception that you're in charge of the entire council, but it's really an administrative function. But a lot of information comes in through the president's office. And so I would say that the core causes of crime and public safety are the things that we really have to address. Whether we're talking about poverty or housing and unhoused people and mental health, all of those things are things that have to be addressed in order to address our public safety issues. If we just keep doing the things that we have done in the past, then we will get the results that we've always gotten. And so I think that reimagining how we do that and the best ways to address the root causes of the things that we see and experience is really important. And I think right now we have the opportunity to do that, and I think we should do it with both feet.
No, thank you both for that. And your response, President James, actually leads into this next question. We do have an opportunity at this moment. I believe Mayor Fisher is going to present his budget soon to the council, and we'll start having this budget conversation around what all of this means and how do we spend our dollars as a community. And how would you, as you think about your personal vision for public safety, how would you like to see that reflected in the budget, in the current budget that's coming in front of you? But then also, as you think about that budget, the dollars that we have from tax base, there's also the American Recovery dollars that are coming in. And how would you like to see both of those pots of money reflected, as you just talked about your vision for public safety? And then I'll also add is that, we've had this conversation not only here, but across the country around divest, invest, defund, and really thinking about the way you all just explained public safety. How do we grapple with that? And how do you like to see it? And I'll start with you, President James. Just how would you like to see your vision outlined in the current budget, and then also an allocation of the American Rescue Act dollars?
I think one of the big things that we are working on right now is, I think it was 2 months ago, we entered into a contract agreement with the University of Louisville to look at deflection, meaning what things are we sending police officers to go to that we really don't need to send police officers to go to. We need to probably send a mental health specialist or a social services person or a medical person even to respond to those situations, because right now we don't have a response for that. If someone calls and says, hey, I'm the manager of the Thorntons at First and Broadway, and Joe's out here again harassing people, blah, 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 I need you to send somebody to help me. Our response to that right now is the police. And one of two things are going to happen. The police are going to run Joe off from the corner, or they're going to arrest Joe and put him in jail. If we put him in jail, we've taken up jail space, and Joe really doesn't need to be in jail. But that's the response that we have. Or we run him off the corner and then he becomes an issue someplace else, as opposed to addressing the core problem with Joe. And so U of L is doing a study on the resources that we currently have and how we can best do that. And I anticipate that in the budget process this year, we will be putting funding into that sort of response. Some people have heard about it in the country called Cahoots or the STAR program in Colorado. Well, it would be the same type of situation here. So I anticipate that we'll be putting funding in that direction, but also believe that once we start doing that, that means that we're going to be feeding people into a system that isn't prepared for that amount of influx. And so we're going to have to either stand up or enhance other resources and responses to be able to help those individuals that are going to be coming into the system. And so I really want us to really address that in the budget this year. And I also think that it's important that as we look back over the past year, that we've learned a lot and talked a lot about equity and inclusion. And and how are we going to look at equity inclusion through the eyes of our budget, the budget being the moral document of our city. And the council passed an ordinance asking the administration to do that with each of its departments as it presents its budget. And so the mayor is going to present that budget today at 4 o'clock. So I'll be very interested to see what that really looks like. But I think it's very important that as the council gets hold of that, that we look at it and we look at it through that lens to make sure that we are being equitable and inclusive in how we distribute the funds for city government to help our citizens.
Thank you, Councilmember George. How would you like to see your the budget reflect your vision, and then also if you could touch on what are your thoughts around the how we allocate the American Rescue Act dollars that are going to be coming? I think we're getting 435 million as a city, which would be totally separate from the other pockets of money.
Yes. So to start there, because I think that's a good place, and I'm going to look at President James to fact check me on some of this as it relates to the funding. My understanding is, as a city, is that we're still learning about the uses of the American Rescue Plan, and that unfortunately we may not have all the specifics in time for our budget process as it evolves. So I just want to say that on the front end is somewhat of a challenge. My understanding of how those funds will be used or could be used would be a lot of how our COVID relief dollars were previously used at the end of last year. So things that were impacting to COVID, not necessarily things that are going to fund new positions for staff. And so with that, though, I do think there comes opportunities, or at least I understand there to be opportunities to shift some of our general fund dollars to programs like what President James spoke of. And in terms of like how that aligns with my vision, absolutely, I've been supportive of deflection models, things that, how can we, again, build that resiliency in the community, provide other tools to our community members to respond to that great array of need that we have, as well as just provide better supports across the community. Again, whether we're talking about community centers, libraries, parks, understanding that, there's certainly a holistic approach that's needed here. I am going to say something, though, that I think is worth a question or a thought. I know, there are lots of good questions to be had about divestment, and particularly in law enforcement agencies. And one of the things that I just want to remind folks, I know one of the questions that was asked was, how does your role as a council member really impact your understanding and your vision? I will say the council offices are in a really good position to be to have a really great awareness of overall community need, particularly for active council offices. Ideally you're seeing the gamut of what those community needs are, and particularly if you represent a district with a lot of diversity, both racially, economically, culturally. And so when you have that understanding or awareness of all those community needs, it really can help enforce, again, the vision for having a more broad understanding of public safety. I think, the other thing that's really important to consider is that council offices are in a good role of connection. So going back to the funding piece, I say all this to say, I'll spend a lot of time, as I know President James does, listening to, yes, District 6 members, but also across Metro. And one of the things that I hear time and time again that community members want to see, particularly as it relates to law enforcement, are things like more community policing, more foot patrols and bike patrols, and more time spent with people, and stronger communication and stronger feedback mechanisms, and all of these things. And I'm going to be honest to say that the things that I hear community members want broadly as it relates to public safety, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's, again, extending out the social service array that we have in our community, all of these things involve more funding, not less. So we find ourselves in a time with COVID where we have a bit of a reprieve in the sense that we know we're going to have these American Rescue dollars coming in. We know there's going to be some opportunities to shift some funding. But at the same time, I want to keep on everyone's radar and forefront. And again, President James, feel free to check me if I'm saying something that doesn't align, the economic issues of the city aren't going to go away. And fundamentally, from my perspective, our metro agencies are called to do more and more and more with less and less and less. And there's not a lot of attention to that connection. And instead, it's conversations around divestment or defund or, whatever the terms are of the day. But again, from my perspective, I see the need for more funding and more investment in all metro agencies and, quite frankly, just quality local governmental services.
So just to follow up on that, thank you for that response, Councilmember George. How do you then respond to the folks who have been protesting for over the last 200 days, who are also have a strong voice around they want to see something different when it comes to policing, and they want to see something different when it comes to law enforcement? So how do you balance those two? Because I think we got to be really, really clear that law enforcement is different for different folks in this community, and it goes down racial lines. And if we do not have that conversation, and if we continue, I think also, so I'm gonna try to set a context real quick, continue as President James talked about, investing in the same things that are not getting us the results that we want. That doesn't sit well with a lot of folks in the community to say, we'll spend 190 million on law enforcement over here, but we'll spend 2 million on the Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods, who is also supposed to be a part of this ideal of public safety. So how do you balance those conversations? And I'll start with you, Councilwoman George, and then go to President James, because I think there's two different conversations happening in this community, and we've got to address both. And I think council has the seat to do that. And how do we do that?
So first of all, I would say to anyone who has been out, who's been personally impacted, we deserve something better. We deserve change. And I guess I would just say, help me better communicate that when I say we broadly need to see greater investments in all metro agencies, and that we need high support to our agencies, and with that will allow high accountability, or should allow high accountability, that isn't the same to say status quo. So I want to be really careful that I'm communicating that well, to say that because I say I see an undersourced metro governmental agency array across the board, that I'm not saying business as usual. I'm saying that and I think to set up the dichotomy of continue to fund LMPD and only see the small amount of money go to safe and healthy neighborhoods, yeah, of course, that balance is off. But setting it up for the dichotomy of safe and healthy neighborhoods and LMPD, I think doesn't take into account all the other social service array, and also doesn't take into account the fact that for many of us, we've been advocating for the Office of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods. We did that when we supported revenue 2 years ago. We said on the front end, there are incredibly promising practices coming out of our Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods, and please not to throw away the program because there's administrative issues, or because that the model itself is strong. So I guess what I would say is, absolutely, we deserve better as a community. Absolutely, we have a responsibility to make improvements, and now is the time. But I would also say that I wouldn't be genuine if I didn't say that the needs that I hear from the community as it relates to quality service array, again, whether that's yes, LMPD, but across the spectrum, involve more investment, not less.
Yeah, thanks for that thanks for clearing that and putting more behind that. So I appreciate that. President James?
I would agree with what Councilwoman George just said. I would say that year after year, Louisville Metro government is doing more and more with less and less to get it done with. And while there would be some that would say, cut the police budget, I would say not so much, because we have a shortage of around 270 police officers. We have people that are waiting 2 and 3 hours for the police to arrive at their house, while shots are being fired into their house because we don't have enough police. And that's just life, and that's the way it is. And we need more police to make those responses. Social workers not going to help that. You need the police for that. And so On the other hand, we're sending police to do things that we don't really need the police to do. And so there is a balance that's going to be worked out as we go through this. And we're probably not going to get it right at the first try. I can tell you that. And we will, over the years, get that balanced out. And it's not going to be a quick fix. But at the same time, you know, we've had some administrative problems with the Office of Healthy and Safe Neighborhoods. We've had administrative problems with the Office of Mayor, right? The accountability piece from the mayor's office over the police department is what led us to the problems we've got right now. And so, so we have a lot of issues that we have to deal with and work on. The legislative body is exactly that, the legislative body. It's not the executive branch. So, so we try to deal with the things that we can with the legislative body and the powers that we have. We also have the power of the bully pulpit, which we use whenever we can. But that's where we are right now.
Yeah, thank you both. I'm gonna move into a couple of questions from the chat box, and we got a couple earlier too. Dealing with the FOP, and it goes back to this conversation around what kind of ordinance or measures can you all pass to ensure transparency in LMPD and FOP kind of negotiations and contracts? Where are you all at with that, and what can you all do to help with the transparency of that, President James?
So we can't do anything for that. The state law, KRS 67C, says that the mayor, as the executive branch, has sole authority as it relates to those negotiations with any collective bargaining agreement that takes place. And that is a negotiation between the bargaining unit, whether it's the FOP, the Teamsters, or ASME, or whoever. And so the only time that the Metro Council has any official say in that is after the mayor has negotiated that and sends it over to us after they have already voted on it, and we either voted up or voted down. But we don't get to interfere or intervene in that process at all.
Okay. Question for you, Council Member George, around there's been a demand and a response for a civilian review board for a long time. We are now at a place where we finally got one, and it's getting ready to be up and running. Why has it been formed now in this moment, and what are your expectations of the board?
So I think just to echo what we all know, which is now is the time. And I think there is that recognition. There have been calls for this in the past. And obviously in light of Breonna Taylor, as well as just what we see nationally, we know that a civilian review is the right thing to do for exactly what President James just mentioned. We have limitations on transparency. And I believe the hope with the civilian review, as well as with the Office of Inspector General, is the idea of bringing some transparency to the process, as well as enhancing communication, enhancing understanding, and really bringing another layer of accountability.
Going back to you, President James, back to the FOP contract. Question is, if it comes to you all in a way, why do we continue to vote for the contract? If you all, what goes into you all's deliberation, I'm assuming, around yes or no to a contract, and how do you hold, because that's the lever that you all have, right? You can say yes or no to that, and it can go back to negotiations. How do you all decide when to vote no and when to vote yes around those to get to more transparency around those contracts?
So we vote no and vote yes based upon whatever language that there is in the contract. I voted no on the last contract because there was some language that was placed in there that I didn't agree with. And so yeah, I think it's each individual council person's decision on what's in the contract and if they agree with it or not.
What language are you looking for, Council President James, when you say it's a certain language? What language is a red flag for you to say that doesn't work?
Yeah, so there was the incident with Breonna Taylor that we all are familiar with. And as you know, the mayor on many occasions in the beginning kept saying that he couldn't fire the officers or suspend them without pay and things like that. And no one could figure out, because it did say that in state law and it didn't say that in the contract. But what we were unaware of at the time was that the mayor had entered into a separate letter of agreement in 2015 that made it very difficult to suspend a police officer without pay based upon some pretty strict language that was even way beyond probable cause, not even reasonable doubt. And so that's why he was making that statement. And so I was shocked to find out that he actually took that letter of agreement and placed it into the contract in Article 15 of the contract to make it permanent. And so that's why I voted against it.
Thank you. Councilmember George, what makes your decision on those contracts when they come in front of you?
So let me first start by saying that to echo the process that President James laid out, we don't get to influence what comes as part of the contracts. And at the end, it is really a yes or no. And so unfortunately, what that means is that you're kind of stuck between the balance of what something does overall. So I did support the FOP contract, and that was not because I supported everything in it. So I want to be clear with that. There are several concerning pieces as it relates to the FOP contract. With that said, the thing that I do support and what tipped me over in terms of being able to be a yes vote was really just the understanding of the ongoing recruitment and retention issues that the force has. And with the understanding that until we address the retention and recruitment issues, which is to say, there's an ongoing flood of officers who leave every year, it becomes increasingly more difficult to recruit a caliber of officer that our community deserves to serve. And because of that, the increase in benefits as related to LMPD staff is what caused me to support the contract. As the basis, which is to say, without support, it becomes increasingly difficult to hold a workforce accountable. So high support, high accountability.
Two more questions for me. One goes back to this ideal of, I think President James talked about the need for multi-responses and different responses. And as we continue to have openings in the police or in law enforcement or wherever part of the public safety, why would we not start shifting from those positions from law enforcement to that alternative kind of response? So how do we balance that out as you all look and see over the next little while? And I heard you, President James, that we got a study going and it's going to take a while. But if we have over 200 positions open and we know we don't need all of them to do law enforcement work, why would we not shift now? And while we have a moment and opportunity to say we want a different response, why not now? Why wait for the study to come out?
So I think one thing to consider is when we voted on the contract, and you'll have to forgive me because I don't remember the date off my head, what I can assure you is that any reduction in existing LMPD staff in this moment is not going to translate into higher quality policing. So President James mentioned over 200 that we're down by 200 staff. And so any decrease in staff is not going to translate into higher quality policing for the simple reason that as it is now, we're not scaled up in the way of social service provision. And in the way that, as we know, more and more is required of, that's not just for LMPD, like more and more is required of all folks who work in public service. And so with that in mind, July 1, when I'm assuming the contract went into effect, you're gonna have the same number of calls to 911 for response, things that, as I understand, we're obligated to respond to now. And again, because we don't have a model and a practice scaled up for deflection, those calls are gonna go somewhere. And so, yes, obviously the overall vision is we'd like to see better use of policing, use of policing that most of us in our community say, yes, this is an appropriate response. If someone, if there's a home invasion, to President James' point, I am a social worker. Please don't call me. I'm not your first line. But with that being said, recognizing that July 1, We don't control what comes into 911, and it increases by the year. And reduction in staff, just to say we're not going to fill it, is not going to translate into higher quality policing. Because what I observe, and I'll be interested when we do our breakout sessions, is I talk to LMPD officers all the time who are overwhelmed, stressed, work long hours, can't get a day off because of the way the staffing patterns work. And so for me, as someone who's worked in state government and worked, with public service employees, that is a recipe for disaster.
President James, last question before I turn it over to Ashley Parrott to take us into the last week. We saw a protester beat up by the police as they were trying to make an arrest. And we keep talking about accountability, and we keep talking about how do we hold police officers accountable for their actions. How do we move that then, right? Because I know one moment we're saying we need them, the next moment we see them actually not doing the work the way it's designed to be done, and folks get hurt, right? Folks get harmed in those incidents. How do you as a council respond to that, and how do we move with that? To your point earlier, when you talked about Breonna Taylor, we could have fired those officers. We thought we could have, and we should have just went through the process. In my opinion, that's an opinion right there. So I just want to make sure it's clear that that's an opinion. But when we see those incidents happen, when folks are exercising their First Amendment right, peacefully protesting, and we see that kind of result, how do we respond to that, and how do we hold police accountable for those actions that we see and community members see, and see them as out of line and out of order, and not what we could seem to protect and serve?
So first of all, I would say, just to be clear, this is my opinion, because the council doesn't get to fire police officers. We don't even get to fire the police chief. Only the mayor gets to do that. And so what occurred on Sunday was unacceptable, and it doesn't fit with what the officers were trained to do, and it was bad. However, I would say that had this happened the same time last year and Chief Conrad would have been involved, I think that we would have had a much different response from the police chief's office. So one of the protesters sent me that video as soon as it happened on Sunday. I immediately sent that to the police chief, and we went back and forth, and I told her exactly what I thought about it, why I thought it was wrong, and why I thought it was bad, and why I thought she needed to do something. And her reply to me was that she totally agreed that it was bad and that it was unacceptable, and that she was immediately going to launch an investigation into the actions of the officers and the lack of actions of the supervisor. Had that have been Chief Conrad last year, his response would have been, I'll have to look into it. And so the differences of leadership and accountability at the top of the police department is night and day. So I feel very confident that Chief Shields will address that issue, address it quickly, and deal with it, and follow the law at the same time, whereas our former police chief would not have done that. And so in order to move to do more efficiently how we get that done, it has to involve changing state law so that we can change the contract. Part of the contract is embedded in the state law. And until we can get state law changed, then it's going to be very difficult to change the contract. And once the contract is changed, some different reforms can come in place within the police contract and with LMPD. But to me, it's all about leadership. And I think that we have a great police chief who's trying to make changes. And I'll just leave it at that.
I just want to thank you both for your openness and the candidness and the response to the questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everybody's question in the chat box. Tried to get as many as possible and try to put some of them together. There's many more questions there. A big question in the box, and I think you guys can answer throughout, is really how can community participate in the budgetary process? How can community have more say in the negotiations around the FOP contract? So there's a lot of folks who want to be involved as far as community goes. And the last thing I would say before I turn it over to Ashley is I think this space right here is also trying to figure out how we be helpful in the realm of public safety. These are all nonprofit leaders, philanthropy leaders, folks who do this work and can help with some of these services that we talked about. And I think part of this is really how we better coordinate our response and how do we use all of the resources that we have at hand and not just rely on what the city has as a city government. So I just want to appreciate the conversation. More to come. Never enough time to get you everything. So I'm gonna turn it to Ashley to help get us ready for our candid conversation. Ashley Parrott.
All right, thank you all so much. And thank you, council members, for joining us. I think it brings some great perspective to this group that they definitely need to continue to be a part of. One thing that continues to come up in the chat is questions about accountability and what does high accountability look like and what does that mean defined? And I think the council members hit on that pretty well, but as we move into the breakout discussions, I'd love for groups to talk about, from your perspective, what would you like to see? What does accountability look like? And then we'll hopefully be able to bring that back to the broader group and have more discussion there because that just keeps coming up. So we're getting ready to move into our small group discussions. We have about 20 minutes to do so. This is our chance there's always new members that come to these meetings. So it's an opportunity for us to engage with each other, get to know each other, build connections. But it's also a chance for us to reflect on everything we've heard. And for those of you who have been a part of these conversations from the beginning, think about all of the stuff we've talked about from, the administration side with, community building and the Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods, community representation, who we've had talk about community-based strategies. Chief Shields came in. So think about that all together when you're thinking about how you reflect on this. So talk about, what are your key reflections? What questions do you have? I mean, there's a lot of questions here in the chat, but what else are the big questions that you have that you feel like it's just not being answered or you just need a little bit more meat to understand? And then as Anthony mentioned, how can nonprofits engage? There's been, I've been asked this question many times, that at what point does it make sense for nonprofits to engage? Is there a timing question? Is there a, how big of a group, how big of a group needs to do that engagement? But then also, do you think about, having one-on-one meetings with council and what's the engagement with the mayor's office, all of that. So think about how nonprofits can support this space. And then we'd love council members' feedback on that as well. So with that, we're going to go ahead and break out into our groups and then come back and share out with the group and continue dialogue. See you all in a minute.